Gentlemen, welcome to the stage, Miss Kris Ann Hall.
So I'm going to take this off of here because number one, I don't stand still, and number two, the thing's taller than me. So thank you everybody for coming out here today, standing in defense of your right to keep and bear arms. I have a tendency to not refer to it according to the Second Amendment, because the danger in that is to describe it as a Second Amendment right. But our Declaration of Independence says, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and endowed by their
Creator.
Constitution,
Creator.
their governor,
Creator.
their creator, with certain inalienable rights. Your right to keep and bear arms is not the product of the Second Amendment. So when we refer to it as a Second Amendment right, then we give way to the enemy to say, okay, well, we can amend that. How many of you know that people are trying to actually amend the Constitution and amend our right to keep and bear arms away from us? We have a former Supreme Court justice who wrote a whole book about the amendment of the Second Amendment that he would propose, that the right of the people to keep and bear arms while in uniform shall not be infringed. Meaning, according to people as high up in the system as the Supreme Court of the United States, your right to keep and bear arms should be equated to your employment for the government. And if you don't work for the government, then you no longer have a right to keep and bear arms. So it's very important that we understand where our rights come from. Now, I'm a constitutional attorney. I hope that you won't hold that against me. I'm a bit of an endangered species because I'm actually a constitutional attorney that understands the Constitution, not one that believes that the Supreme Court is the rulers of the universe. But we as a people, we've got to get to the core of this, because we have to understand where our rights come from. They don't come from government. They don't come from your governor. They don't come from documents. They come from God. And what God gives you, no man can take away.
Amen.
And we've got to understand that even though they come from God, they are ours. It's why our founders used those words, inalienable. They're ours without question. When we do nothing, when the people come against us, people in power, and they tell us, oh, well, you have to surrender this right, or you have to apply for permission for this right. If we stand in silence or we simply comply, we are actually complicit in the surrendering of something that God Himself has given us. And then what happens is, you can't point your finger at anybody but here.
Amen.
You see, there's a difference between a right and a permission. If you have to fill out a form, if you have to follow these certain rules in order to achieve a permit, then it is no longer a right. It is a privilege bestowed upon you by people in power. And what we ought to be seeing now, what we ought to be recognizing now above everything else, is that a privilege given is a permission that can also be revoked. First and foremost, that should come to our minds today as something that our founders wouldn't even believe was happening in our America. Something that I personally would not even believe would happen in America 5 years ago, is the process of these red flag laws. We are in bipartisan jeopardy of our rights. How many of you recognize that? It was a Republican governor that signed the red flag laws here in the state of Florida. We have Republican sheriffs all over stepping up and declaring these red flag laws. I live in Hillsborough County. Sheriff Chad Cronister was one of the first ones to step up and declare that he would be enforcing red flag laws. That's why we call him on our show Red Flag Chad. This is a big problem, America, because these red flag laws do not simply endanger your right to keep and bear arms. They endanger your right to be secure in your property. They are unlawful searches and seizures. They are effectuated on the people without probable cause, without proper dedication and due process to the rights of the people. Do you know, in the state of Florida, an anonymous person can call in to the police department or to a judge and say that they think you're scary, and that judge can issue a warrant based on an anonymous complaint to come to your house and take your guns. Wow. And if you have a sheriff that says, I will enforce that, you have a sheriff who has said to you by public declaration, my oath to me is garbage and your rights mean even less. Amen. It is up to us to stand up and defend our rights. You need to ask your sheriff, where do you stand on red flag laws? You need to be involved. How many of you have spoken to your sheriff in the last 30 days? See, this is a problem that we have in America. We are no longer involved at the local level. We have become so enamored by the glitz and glamour of federal politics that we have turned our back and become negligent to the politics that mean so much to us. Your sheriff is the most important constitutional officer in your life. Your sheriff does not take an oath to enforce the law. Your sheriff does not take an oath to support the governor of the state. Your sheriff does not take an oath to bow down and kowtow to every federal agency in America. Your sheriff takes an oath to support and defend the Constitution of the United States and the Constitution of the state of Florida, period. And in that oath, in the principle of that oath, is the inherent duty. A duty is a word that relies on obligation. You see, right and duty are a little bit different. We all have inalienable rights by the nature of our creation. They're ours. We don't have to do anything to get them. That's why filling out a permit and asking permission is contradictory to a right. It's yours. Nothing else has to happen. But a duty is greater than a right, because a duty implies you have an obligation to do something. We have a duty to secure the rights and that we possess naturally for our future generations. And in that duty, we must stand against anyone and everyone that would jeopardize those rights. And it doesn't matter if they're your best friend. It doesn't matter if they're your next door neighbor. It doesn't matter if you've known them for 75 years. The minute they profess an indication that they're going to operate contrary to your rights, they're not jeopardizing your rights. They're jeopardizing the rights of your children, your grandchildren, and generations to come. Samuel Adams warned us, when we tamely suffer a lawless attack upon our liberty, we encourage it. When we step back and allow people to infringe upon our rights, when we stand silent, when people even suggest that they have an authority to infringe upon our rights, we actually encourage that deprivation. And Samuel Adams continues and says, and we involve others in our doom. He said it's a serious consideration that should weigh heavy upon our hearts, that ages and millions yet unborn will be the miserable sharers of our experience when we step by and do nothing. We have the power. We are not a government of oligarchy. We are not a government of monarchy. We are a government of the people, self-governance. We don't have rulers over us. The people are supposed to rule over their governors. But when we step back and we well, he's elected, we got to respect the office. We're actually creating the demise of the liberty of our future generations. And so with self-governance comes personal responsibility and accountability. We got to stop pointing fingers at people and start getting to work in the streets. If your sheriff will not unequivocally declare, without question, without waiver, that he will or she will not enforce these red flag laws, you need a new sheriff. Because this is not just a jeopardy of your right to keep and bear arms. It is, but not just. How many of you realize today, now more than ever, that there is a strong public movement to disarm America? If you recognize that, we ought not be just sitting at meetings. We ought to be going door to door and educating our neighbors. See, I'm a Christian. And God commands me to love my neighbor as myself. I'm not loving my neighbor if I allow my neighbor to continue to operate in ignorance and manipulation to his own demise. We're here, and we're a strong core of people who actually believe that the right to keep and bear arms is important. Do you believe that?
Amen.
I would challenge you to not simply believe that the right to keep and bear arms is important, but to believe and to know that the right to keep and bear arms is essential. Richard Henry Lee, one of the founders of our country. Actually, without Richard Henry Lee, there would have been no Declaration of Independence. He wrote the document that brought us the Declaration of Independence, the legal legislation that created our independence from Great Britain on July 2nd, 1776. Let me just, as one of my professors used to say, give you a little bonus for your educational dollar. Legally and technically, July 4th is not our Independence Day. It is not. July 2nd is our Independence Day. July 2nd is when our Continental Congress ratified into law the separation of the American colonies from the British government, creating us as 13 independent sovereign states. John Adams wrote home to his wife Abigail on July 3rd that July 2nd will be an epic day in America where Americans will celebrate their independence forever. And it wasn't until the mid to late 1800s that we began celebrating Independence Day on July 4th. Part of the reconstruction and retransformation and the revision of American history. So maybe you could believe that once again, it's the federal government that we have to thank for our independence, and not a core of patriots who believed in liberty for all so deeply that they stood up and said, "No more kings." See, when we're separated from that history, we're separated from that dedication. We are separated from that passion. People always ask me, "Kris Ann, how do you maintain your passion? How do you do that?" Because I am in know why our history books won't teach that. They are draining the liberty blood life from our American system on purpose and leaving us powerless and anemic and susceptible to their influence, manipulation, and lies. And that will only change when we change this. Richard Henry Lee said, whereas to preserve liberty, it is essential that the whole body of the people always possess arms. Now, if something is essential, can you do without it? No. He also said always. If you're always doing something, is there ever a time when you're not doing it? So Richard Henry Lee is speaking out to us through the ages and saying, if you are not packing right now, you are not engaged in the preservation of liberty. But we have been fundamentally transformed. We have been educationally brainwashed to disarm ourselves. Do you see what's happening in Seattle? Do you know why that's happening in Seattle? It is happening in Seattle because we have been disarmed. Why does it continue in Seattle? Because we have been disarmed. Because the rest of the world is standing around on edge of seat with bated breath, waiting to see who's going to come in and rescue the people. America was established on the principle of love your neighbor as yourself, under the principle that we have a right to defend our life, our liberty, and our property, under the understanding that doing that, it's essential that we always keep and bear arms. Do you know 1774, the governor of Massachusetts, appointed by the king, Thomas Gage was his name, went in 1774 and disarmed one town. And within 24 hours, he didn't even show up and take their guns. He just showed up into the town and seized all their gunpowder, all their ammunition. And within 24 hours in 1774, 20,000 men aged 16 to 64 were marching from all over the colonies to Boston because they said the governor has just declared war on the people. Where is that spirit? It's been stolen from us through miseducation, misinformation, and brainwashing. I keep using that term brainwashing, but you got to realize that's not my word, that's theirs. In 1992, Eric Holder, how many of you know who Eric Holder is? In 1992, Eric Holder was a U.S. attorney appointed by Ronald Reagan, stood up and gave a speech, said it's not enough to just do public service announcements on Wednesday and have flyers on Friday. He said in 1992, we need to be in the neighborhoods, we need to be in the schoolhouses. He said we need to fundamentally change the way people think about guns. He said we need to, these are his words, brainwash the people to think differently about guns. Now, how many of you think that makes you angry? The problem is, how many years ago was that? And Eric Holder was speaking reality and prophecy on today. Because 6 blocks of Seattle are gone because the people have been brainwashed to think differently about guns. And you think, oh, well, that's just Seattle. That's one of the leftist liberal strongholds. But let me tell you what, here in Florida, the red flag laws do the exact same thing. Because a red flag law not only endangers your right to keep and bear arms, it's not only an unlawful search and seizure, it is a theft of your property without due process.